Okay.
Real loud. Real loud.
Hi, I'm Cheyenne Douglas, and Social Justice Club and Student Council is honored today to have Elizabeth Eckford, one of the Little Rock Nine, who was among the first African-American students to integrate into white schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. With her today is Ken Reinhardt, one of the 2 white students at Little Rock Central High to befriend her. 40 years after the integration, Elizabeth Eckford has a colorful life to look back upon. She went on to become the first African-American to work a non-janitorial position in a bank in St. Louis. She later attended Central State College in Wilberforce, Ohio, where she graduated with a degree in history. Elizabeth has worked as a substitute teacher in Little Rock and has also completed some journalist work while serving in the U.S. Army. She has many great achievements, such as being the recipient of the Army's Good Conduct Medal, the NAACP Spin Guard Medal, and also received the Congressional Gold Medal. She now resides in Little Rock, Arkansas, where she is a former member on the board of directors of Central High's Museum and Visitor Center. She has worked with unemployment, welfare, and employment offices. Please help me in welcoming Kendall Reinhardt and Elizabeth Eckford.
Ken Reinhardt will begin, and I will join him presently.
Good afternoon. We welcome the opportunity to be here with you. I'm going to be kind of doing the outline through a PowerPoint presentation, and Liz will come and join me as she feels comfortable with what she wants to share and at the appropriate time. And Mike, if we could get to that first slide of that. We're basically going to be talking about 2 events. The first, what was my senior year in Little Rock Central High School in 1957 and 1958, and what went on that year. And secondly, the experience we shared at National History Day in 1996. And as I begin, let me give you a few caveats. First of all, I will be using the word nigger in my presentation. I do not want to sanitize the ugliness of what took place then by being politically correct now. It's not part of my vocabulary, but I heard it every day of my senior year. Second, throughout my presentation, I will use the word black instead of Afro-American. It's the term that Liz and I primarily grew up with. Finally, I come from an extremely emotional and expressive family. My mother says we all cry at supermarket openings. And this is extremely personal for me, and I may struggle through some of it, but it doesn't embarrass me. It just makes it difficult for me to talk. So if it happens, I don't want you to be uncomfortable. In order for you to fully appreciate what happened in Little Rock, let me remind you about the state of race relations in 1957. Blacks and whites were totally segregated in every area of public life. If a bus was full, blacks who were supposed to ride in the back were to get up and give their seats to any whites who needed a seat. The word nigger was socially acceptable, politically correct, and commonly used. White adults commonly addressed black males, both adult and children, as boy. 1957 was 3 years before sit-in protests began at Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, and spread across the nation. It was 7 years before 3 civil rights workers were murdered in Mississippi, and President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it was 11 years before Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Anywhere segregation was challenged, the potential for violence was pervasive. In Arkansas, following the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling, the Federal Appeals Court ordered the desegregation of Little Rock Central High School. At the time, Little Rock Central High School was ranked educationally, got another one after that, Mike? There we go. As one of the top 38 high schools in the nation. The New York Times wrote that when it was built in 1927, it was the most expensive school ever built in the United States. Spanning 2 city blocks, it was the largest high school in the nation until 1940. The National Association of Architects named it the most beautiful building in America. In 1957, we were about the size of Lincoln High School. There were 2,100 students enrolled and 600 in my senior's class. Governor Orville E. Faubus defied the order of the president to desegregate the schools, inflating the already volatile situation in Little Rock. 2 weeks before school was to start, a rock was thrown through the plate glass window in the home of Mrs. Daisy Bates. Mrs. Bates was president of the Arkansas NAACP and the most prominent black leader in the state. A note tied to the rock said, "Stone this time, dynamite next, the Ku Klux Klan." 2 days later, an 8-foot cross was burned in her front yard. The sign near the cross bore this message, "Go back to Africa, the Ku Klux Klan." This is how tense and dangerous race relations were when school started 2 weeks later.
In 1948, a school teacher sued the Little Rock School District so that black teachers would receive salaries equal to those of white teachers. That teacher was not rehired until 1955. In 1955, the first school to ever voluntarily desegregate occurred in a small town in Arkansas, Charleston, Arkansas. Before 1957, some very small schools in northwest portion of Arkansas voluntarily desegregated. In those school districts, there was a very, very small black population. Those school boards had borne the expense of transporting their black students to other school districts and paying their tuition to have them educated in other school districts. In Hoxie, Arkansas, the Ku Klux Klan stepped forward and tried to turn around the decision to voluntarily desegregate the schools. In Arkansas, we have a tradition of being very resentful of outsiders. In Hoxie, Arkansas, these Ku Klux Klans were considered outsiders, and they were ignored. In 1957, when the Little Rock School District announced its plan to have a limited, total, gradual segregation plan, I and many students at Parsman, the newly made senior high school that had made a plan in preparation for the desegregation, Little Rock School District opened 2 new high schools, one for us in the eastern industrial section of Little Rock, where they had scraped off and dug up a cemetery to build a school for us. They had also built a school section sitting in Pulaski Heights where Ken lived. It was Hall High School. It was built in anticipation that the children of the elite will not have to endure the segregation. Part of the resentment of the people who were opposed to the segregation was class-based resentment. They felt that they were targeted, whereas the people who ran the block, business leaders, children, would not have to endure this. In spring 1957, while I was at Parsman in the all-black school, our teachers came to us and told us that Central High School would be desegregated the following fall, and those students who were interested could sign a list indicating that they wanted to go. I was one of the 200 students who signed that list. Prior to that, 85 students' parents had been plaintiffs in a suit filed by the NAACP trying to affect the shape of the segregation that was to come. The superintendent of the school said that he would make the final selection, and that his selection would include students who were good students, and he did not want troublemakers. In the South at that time, any Negro alive within a certain effective organization like the NAACP was considered a troublemaker. So, of the 200 students, the 85 students alive in the NAACP were automatically eliminated in the superintendent's mind. I'm going to stop here and let Ken continue.
By the time school started, that list had been narrowed down to 9 teenagers that had been selected to be the first black students at Central High. Carlotta Walls, Melba Patillo, Terrence Roberts, Gloria Ray, Thelma Mothershed, Ernest Green, Elizabeth Eckford, Minnie Jean Brown, and Jefferson Thomas. On the first day, the 9 black students were to meet at their school, Horace Mann High School, and be escorted in by 2 black ministers and 2 white ministers. Elizabeth did not have a phone in her home, and she did not get the message and showed up alone. It was her picture that covered the newspaper of the world as she showed up alone. Thousands of white adults and students covered the streets and schoolyards shouting obscenities and threatening to lynch this diminutive, frightened girl. She was spat on, jostled, and turned away at every entrance by the Arkansas National Guard. She finally made it to a bus stop and went home. The other 8 blacks arrived later and were also turned away. I want you to hear how Elizabeth described her experience as recorded in the Washington Post. That morning, in the carefully ironed dress she had made for her first day at the White High School, Eckford began walking toward the building when a mob quickly surrounded her. She tried different entrances to the school, but was blocked at each doorway by Arkansas National Guardsmen who were instructed not to let the black students inside. I tried to see a friendly face somewhere in the mob, someone who maybe would help, Eckford is quoted as saying. I looked into the face of an old woman, and it seemed a kind face, but when I looked again, she spat on me. As I said, Elizabeth made it to a bus stop and went home. This is a blank one, Mike. 2 weeks went by while the mob continued to demonstrate. And on Wednesday, September 25th, the mob arrived at school to find it surrounded by 1,000 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, who had arrived in the middle of the night.
I want to interrupt here. We went back to school on September 23rd. Central spans a 2-block area. The mob was gathered at the corner of 14th and Park, and we entered by a side entrance of 16th and Park. It took over an hour before they realized that we were inside. When the students realized that we were inside, some of them panicked so badly that they jumped from second-floor windows. By then, the governor had removed the Arkansas National Guard. The city police were there with their barricades, but they were not able to hold back the mob. So after being in school an hour and a half, they came to us and told us they had to remove us for our own safety. I remember the chief of police had unmarked cars inside the building. There were policemen in civilian clothes. He told us to stay down in the car. He told the policemen to drive fast and to not stop for anything. I realize now they saved our lives. The reason President Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division, the reason President Eisenhower came to me when I didn't grow up to do so, indeed before 1957, no federal authority, no governmental authority had acted to enforce court decrees. Mob rule had prevailed in Clinton, Tennessee, and in Marshall, Texas. Indeed, in Marshall, Texas, the governor had sent state police to enforce mob rule, turning back an attempt to segregate schools. President Eisenhower took federal control of the Arkansas National Guard and ordered the 101st Airborne Division to little while. Because he saw the images that were plastered around the world of this black reporter being beaten by the mob, he saw the reality of the United States being betrayed around the world rather than our deals.
This next slide is a highlight from that front page. Liz pointed this out to me. I had not noticed it. If you go to that next slide, Mike. That is the caravan of the 101st coming in about 3 a.m. in the morning, and look at the billboard sign that's behind us. Louisville, Arkansas. If our old people do not. Very ironic picture in the paper. The next two, if you'll go to those, Mike, just highlight from there. The State Guard was federalized, and then the third one shows about the president's address about the situation the night before. And my question to you would be, imagine how you would feel if you had been getting ready for school this morning, and this was the front page of your local newspaper. In just 2 weeks, these young men of the 101st established order. And then they were replaced again by the National Guard, this time having been federalized and ordered by the president to protect the black students. The guardsmen bivouacked on our football field, tents, helicopters, and all. Go ahead, Mike. These pictures are from my high school annual. Go to the next one. And the next. That's what it looked like in the schoolyard every day. And the next. And that's what it looked like in the schoolyard every day. Every day for weeks, the mob continued to show up, and white students gathered at the front entrance, shouting insults and obscenities as the 9 black students entered. One of the guardsmen was assigned to each black student and followed them from class to class, some 10 to 15 feet behind, carrying their rifles. Every day, the black students were body slammed into lockers, tripped as they walked down the hall, shoved down the steps, verbally threatened and insulted by other white students. Guards only intervened if there was an egregious event, and few of the students were punished. Few of us who are white could ever understand what these 9 brave teenagers endured.
The soldiers were commanded by General Eckford, who, when he retired, was present in 1963 at Ole Miss in the mob that tried to turn away James Meredith at the University of Mississippi. The soldiers' orders were not to intervene in most instances. They did intervene. They safeguarded her when acid was thrown in her face. The guard had the presence of mind to rush into a water fountain. They saved Terrence and Jack when they were knocked down and were being stomped in the hallway. They did pull the attackers off them. But the soldiers' orders were to observe and to report what they saw. We were told by the principal to report incidences to our vice principals, and we did so. But the principal did not act on any reports if they were not corroborated by a teacher. Very seldom the teachers present in the hallway observing what was going on. So in fact, the students had free rein to attack us throughout the school year. Eventually, they did realize that Thelma Mothership had a hole in her heart that they could kill her. And they did reduce the physical attacks on her. And they told me that they wanted to drive us away, but they didn't want to kill us.
One of the 9, Minnie Jean Brown, had lunch hour the same time I did. Sometime in October, one of the more actively hostile whites dumped a bowl of chili over her shoulder and down the front of her white blouse. The next day, Minnie Jean bought a bowl of chili, walked calmly to this boy's table, and dumped the chili upside down on his head. It was one of the bravest things I have ever witnessed. I don't know how big your cafeteria is, but our cafeteria seated 910, so there was a large crowd in there when she did that.
The large crowd of hospital people, the young people who were employed were black food service workers. The only black people we saw all day were the food service workers and the janitors. At that time, there was not an alcohol, tobacco, and firearms bill. There were many bomb threats. The school board's response was to hire 26 additional janitors to open every locker, every day. Only once was dynamite found. We had a lot of fire drills. Ken looks at that incident differently than I do. Because if we retaliate, we do, then we will be subject to expulsion. At first, we tried to hold on for each other. Eventually, we realized because of the opposition that was arrayed against us, that the pace of the segregation, whether or not the segregation would proceed, depended on us sticking it out. Sometimes, when you are doing something really hard, and you want to quit, you will quit if it's just yourself. But when you know that it's bigger than yourself, that other people are depending on you, it helps you find that you have steel. It helps you hold on longer. Sometimes, in holding on, all you can do is be present. Sometimes, there were many days, but all I could do is put my clothes on and go back to the hellhole one more day. Sometimes I was just like, but knowing that it goes beyond yourself helps you to hold on longer.
Mike, if you would put it up, leave it up there for a minute. All this hatred was a shock to me, and I had numerous arguments with my classmates. To this day, I think I understand prejudice, but I will never understand the vitriol, the hate. Race had never been an issue in my home. The value of people was a given. While I never thought anything about the segregated society I was brought up in, I still never thought blacks to be anything less than fellow human beings whom God loved and Christ died for. That's how I was brought up. I was dumbfounded by both adults and schoolmates who considered blacks to be innately inferior in intelligence, and even more astounding, to not have souls. One day in October, I sat down at the table of Jefferson Thomas, another of the Little Rock Nine, Mike, if you'll put his up there, who was eating lunch alone. My visit startled him, and he timidly accepted my outstretched hand. I told him not everyone hated him, and I was glad to have him in our school. The next day, a group of my classmates shoved me to the floor of the locker room before gym class and warned me not to socialize with the niggers. I hope that word is as repugnant to your ears as it is to my wife's and mine. If it isn't, it should be. You'll go to the blank slide and leave it up. It's the next one. From that day forward, not a day went by that someone did not call me a nigger lover, traitor to my race, and other things. I know now with Judy's helpful insight that many of my classmates felt like I did, but their parents would not have supported them like mine did. My parents started receiving threatening and insulting phone calls, most of them late at night. Most of the callers said something like, "I guess you're proud of your nigger-loving son." My dad would say, "I sure am," and hang up. My mom received an anonymous phone call that a mob was going to be waiting for me at the end of the bus line to beat me up. These two women, both about yay tall, grabbed a tire iron, jumped in the car, and raced to the bus stop to protect me from the mob. There was no mob, just another terroristic threat. But that threat and others like it had their desired effect. Overnight, my mom developed a shock of white hair about 2 inches wide from the middle of her forehead back. The mother of Jefferson Thomas received an even worse anonymous call. She was told to come to school because her son had been killed. And she didn't know until she got there that it was untrue. As school progressed, I made a point of speaking these to the black students. I visited with Ernest Green in my homeroom, with Terrence Roberts in my history class, and with Elizabeth Eckford in my speech class. We didn't talk about what was going on, we just visited. Terrence was both shy and scared. He didn't say much. He would acknowledge the conversation, but didn't have a lot to add. Well, as the year progressed, I became increasingly isolated from my white classmates, and as the phone calls continued, my parents restricted my nighttime and weekend activities. The principal called the week of graduation and suggested that they accompany me to graduation and go straight home afterwards. We did, and nothing else happened. But on the last day of finals, my worst tormentor walked up to me in gym class and punched me in the face. Coaches and other students said nothing and did nothing, and that was the end of it. Incidentally, Dr. Martin Luther King attended our graduation and sat with the family of Ernest Green. Mike, the next one up. The first black to ever graduate from Little Rock Central High School. This is Ernest and me before the graduation ceremony. If one picture is worth 1,000 words, you can guess what all the people in the background are saying to us. Liz saw this picture in an Arkansas paper about 3 years ago, and the caption said, "Ernest Green and an unidentified white student." And she recognized me, called the paper, got the black and white photo, and sent it to me. So I now have that treasure to use for my presentation.
to go to Black Flag.
It's not a privilege to be able to speak to you together, and it's only the second past year that we've been able to do this. I've talked about him since leaving Central. It was only in the 1960s that I felt safe enough to identify him by name. Here is an example of Martin Luther King saying that the true measure of a man is not where he stands in times of comfort, but where he stands in times of controversy. Here's an example of real courage. I want you to know that. I applaud that, and I say thank you again.
In 1958, Governor Faubus closed all the high schools in Little Rock for 1 year, rather than let integration proceed. I went on to college, and my sister Katie, a 10th grader, had to go live with my grandmother in Memphis, Tennessee. She attended Los Angeles School for Girls for a year, and then returned the following year when schools were open.
The closing of all the high schools in Little Rock affected 3,000 students, black and white. At that time, there was not very much of a private school system. The surrounding North Little Rock and Pulaski County school systems did not have space for very many students. Most of those students were not being sent elsewhere to school because most parents couldn't afford to send their kids someplace else to go to school. So for some, it delayed their education. For some, it got diverted and it ended their education. And there were others like me who took correspondence courses to complete high school. I didn't get enough credits to finish high school, so I don't have a high school diploma. Many years later, when I wanted to join the Army, my recruiter took me to another county where I received the GED by examination. So, I stand before you as somebody who has both a GED and a BA in history. Proud of both of them.
She's not telling you the whole story. She also taught history and geography. Her geography teacher told her, "You must be spreading mass ignorance." She must not have been a good geography student. Until 2001, after she had returned to Little Rock, she lived in the modest house where she grew up in Little Rock. Liz was diagnosed with post-stress traumatic disorder, which you do not recover from. She was forced to give up her teaching career and live on a modest disability income. For 39 years, no one asked me about that year. It was ancient history and nobody was interested. I had no contact with Liz or any of the Little Rock Nine during all of that time. Uniontown High School in Uniontown, Kansas is an all-white student body of 150 students. Their social science teacher, Norm Kennard, is an innovative and enthusiastic supporter of National History Day. One of his students, a junior at the time, was Heather Jurgensen. After viewing the documentary Eye on the Prize, she wanted to do a video on Elizabeth for her National History Day competition. Norm took Heather and 2 other students to Little Rock to interview Elizabeth and visit the high school. The 2 classmates, David Foster and Jeremy Johnson, hoped to pick up an idea for their own project. And they asked Liz if any of the white students had been kind to her. And she said there were 2, Ken Reinhardt and Ann Williams. The boys looked up in the directory. I now live in Louisville, Kentucky, but my dad, who is Ken Reinhardt Sr., still lives in Little Rock. And so they found his name, called him, he gave them my number, and they began to interview me and Judy by telephone. They decided to do a drama entitled Jim Crow and Daisy Blossom Meet Kendall Reinhardt. When all 3 students won their state competition, they separately invited me and Elizabeth to come to the national competition. I had not seen her talk to Elizabeth in all those years. So, Judy and I contacted Liz. We drove to Little Rock and had an emotional visit with her in her home. Until that day in her home, I had no idea that our daily conversations had meant so much to her. Elizabeth was quoted in one interview as saying that the only thing that got her through some days was knowing that she would have a normal conversation with two fellow students in her afternoon speech class. The three of us did a lot of hugging and crying in Elizabeth's home, and we decided to go. When we left, she asked me to thank my parents for their courage and what they had had to live through that year. For 3 weeks during the week of June 10th, for 3 days during the week of June 10th, 1996, the three of us were treated like royalty at National History Day. We were interviewed by CNN, by NBC, by Robert Siegel on National Public Radio, by the Washington Post, and we went to see the boys' presentation of the drama. If you'll go to that next slide. David portrayed me and Jeremy portrayed an Arkansas segregationist. It was uncanny how accurate the content of their debate was. Much of it was from their own research with a little input from Judy and me. You might notice down on the bottom right-hand side that book that says Picks on it. That was our high school annual. The boys asked me if they could borrow it for the presentation. I said, sure, and I sent it down there. Find out later, Little Rock Central keeps their copy in a vault in the school. There's only one copy of it. But they took good care of it, and I still have it. After this, we went to hear and see Heather's presentation, video presentation on Liz, entitled For Generations Yet Unborn. On Wednesday, we watched the final competitions. We went to the headquarters of then Kansas Senator Nancy Kassebaum. And Thursday morning, we attended the award ceremony with 5,600 competitors and their supporters. Elizabeth and I were invited to sit on the platform at the Cole Field House and give out some of the awards. We were introduced to a standing ovation and presented with a wall hanging that had a pin from each of the 49 states of the students who were represented in that year's competition. Many of the students, as they crossed the stage, the students and their teachers, would detour people from other states who had no contact with this issue whatsoever to come over and shake hands with Elizabeth. I think they were as proud to meet her as they were to get their awards. Heather's video placed ninth in the nation, and the boys' drama placed fourth. That very day, a two-page article in the Washington Post was published about Elizabeth, me, the three kids from Kansas, and what had taken place. It was the most extensive coverage of our experience. On Thursday, we all went back to our everyday lives being everyday citizens. But it was the most honor that Judy and I have ever felt, and it was a healing, affirming experience for Elizabeth and a beginning of her rebirth. She went home to Little Rock with absolutely no fanfare. Time won't allow me to fully explain all that's happened since then, but let me go as quickly as I can. When we returned, stories of our experience appeared in our local newspaper, the Courier-Journal, in the Dallas Morning News. Heather Jurgensen was determined to get this story into a history book, and she did. It is now part of one publisher's high school textbook on Black history. I've had the opportunity to share this story with some 20 groups, numerous churches, an international reconciliation conference, now in the 10th state that we've been to, getting an opportunity to do this. But most importantly, Judy and I have become close friends with Elizabeth and all the people from Uniontown. We visit Elizabeth every time we visit my parents in Little Rock, which brings me to the happiest part of this whole story. In her own words, Elizabeth had shut down emotionally for 30 years and had granted few requests to be interviewed or to speak in public. She told me that one day a reporter came to the door asking for Elizabeth Eckford, and she told him she passed away. After National History Day, Elizabeth began to accept more invitations to be interviewed, to speak, and to appear in public. 1 year later, in September of 1997, Central High School commemorated the 40th anniversary of the 1957 event. It was a week-long celebration, if you can call it a celebration. Speeches were given by President Clinton, Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, and Ernest Green. Go past the next. This is President Clinton speaking, and you can see the crowd that attended. Governor Huckabee stated flatly that what happened in 1957 was a sin that must never be repeated. Ernest Green completed his speech with this statement: "If what we endured encourages just one black child to pursue his dreams, then the Little Rock 9 becomes the Little Rock 10. President Clinton then held open the doors of the high school while the Little Rock Nine made a symbolic entrance. This is the Little Rock Nine that day before the president escorted them in. Coming into Liz today, they've changed a little bit in appearance. Incidentally, Norm Kennard brought 20 students with him to cover the event. The story published in Uniontown High School paper won the monthly High School News Story Award in Kansas the following month. During the week-long commemoration, a photographer named Will Counts, who took the dramatic photo of Elizabeth being hounded by the mob, arranged another meeting between Elizabeth and the white girl, shouting at her in the photo.
The girl with a light-colored dress was named Hazel Bryan. I never met her until 1997. She called me in 1963 and apologized. But at the time she apologized, I didn't know which of the girls behind me she was. To this day, she's the only person who's ever apologized to me. In 1998, Hazel and I went through a 12-week racial healing course that was helpful to both of us. Subsequent to that, we spent more than a year talking to students who had come to Little Rock from elsewhere in their study of the civil rights movement. Talking to students I have found to be enabling for me. So I always look forward to seeing students. Thank you very much for your attention and support. Ken wants to finish up a little bit more.
I refuse to complete this without you getting to see some of the other things that have happened to Elizabeth. To go to the next photo, Mike. During 1997, that photographer got the two of them together again, and this time photographed them in front of the high school with smiles on their faces. It's been made into what is called a reconciliation poster. And in the bottom right-hand corner, it's the black and white photo from 1957.
But I have to say, and I mean this very seriously, you don't have to atone to be forgiven, because after all, the forgiveness is an act on the part of the person forgiving you. But for true reconciliation to occur, we Americans, all of us, have to be willing to honestly look at our shared painful past if we are to have true reconciliation.
On November 9th, 1999, the Little Rock Nine were presented with the Congressional Gold Medal, this nation's highest non-combat award. At Elizabeth's invitation, Judy and I got to go. After the presentation ceremony, we got to meet President Clinton and have our picture taken with him, Elizabeth, and the other friends she had invited. It was a long overdue but fitting tribute to these young pioneers of civil rights. In March of 2000, Judy and I spent a week with my parents in Little Rock. Elizabeth went to dinner with the four of us. It was the first time my parents.
I was able to say to his parents a long overdue thank you, because I realized they had risked the family's livelihood in supporting Ken. So they would do. Thank you.
At dinner, we visited my parents' apartment and looked through the ever-growing scrapbook that we used to document these events. Last December, for the first time, Elizabeth and I were invited to speak together. It was at a Civil Rights Awareness Week at James Madison High School. Commented to her this morning, I'm wearing the same outfit. Today, Elizabeth has a new career as a probation officer at the 1st Division Circuit Court in Little Rock. When she's not with me, this is how I conclude. She is a remarkably strong, courageous, intelligent, articulate, and witty woman. I wish you all could know her. And you do. Thank you.
We started out as 200 Negro students who signed up to go to Central. Those who eventually went were not the ones chosen. We were not a group. I didn't even know everybody. We are ordinary people. Each of us is an ordinary person. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That applies to each of you too. The superintendent said that those chosen had to be good students. And in my 61 years, in various learning environments, I've learned that a good student is a person who believes in the ability to learn and works to achieve. That could be any one of you. A good student is a person who believes in themselves and invests in themselves. That could be any one of you. Thank you very much.
Students will now return to your 7th period class. Thank you.